Jake Martinez sat in the corner of the officers' club, watching the young pilots laugh and drink. The space station's main social area buzzed with noise and energy. Bright lights reflected off the metal walls, and the sound of glasses clinking mixed with loud conversations. Jake held his beer with his right hand, keeping his left arm close to his side. Under his dark jacket, no one could see the prosthetic limb that had replaced his real arm 3 years ago. At 45, Jake felt old compared to the fighter pilots around him. Most of them were in their 20s, fresh from the academy, full of confidence and stories about their latest training missions. They wore their uniforms with pride, showing off their rank badges and unit patches. Jake wore simple civilian clothes, a plain black jacket, dark pants, and worn boots. Nothing about him suggested he had ever been in the military. The orbital defense station, where Jake now worked as a maintenance supervisor, was home to thousands of people. Military personnel, civilian contractors, and their families all lived and worked in the massive structure that orbited Earth. The officers' club was supposed to be a place where everyone could relax together, but Jake had noticed the invisible lines that separated different groups. The pilots stuck with pilots. The officers talked only to other officers, and civilians like Jake were mostly ignored. Jake had been coming to the club for several weeks now, always sitting alone, always quiet. He never bothered anyone, never tried to join conversations, never complained when younger people took the tables he was heading for. Some people might have thought he was shy or antisocial. The truth was simpler. Jake had learned to be careful about drawing attention to himself. Across the room, Lieutenant Beth Collins nudged her friend Rick Palmer and pointed toward Jake's corner table. Beth was 26 years old, with short blonde hair and bright green eyes that always seemed to be looking for trouble. She flew reconnaissance missions and had a reputation for being both skilled and mischievous. Rick was her usual partner in pranks, a tall guy with an easy smile who piloted supply runs between the station and Earth. "Look at him," Beth whispered to Rick, trying not to laugh. "He comes in here every night, sits alone, barely talks to anyone. I feel kind of sorry for him." Rick took a sip of his drink and studied Jake. "Maybe he likes being alone. Some people are just quiet. Or maybe he needs help meeting people," Beth said, her eyes lighting up with an idea. "You know what would be funny? Setting him up on a blind date. With who?" Rick asked, though he could already see the wheels turning in Beth's head. "Commander Hayes," Beth said with a grin. Rick nearly choked on his drink. "Lisa Hayes? Are you crazy?" She would freeze him solid with one look. She doesn't date anyone, especially not some random civilian maintenance guy. Commander Lisa Hayes was the station's head of tactical operations. At 32, she had already earned a reputation as one of the smartest military minds in the fleet. She was also known for being completely focused on her work, with no time for personal relationships. Most people on the station were a little afraid of her. "That's what makes it perfect," Beth explained. "It would be so awkward that it's funny. Besides, maybe it would be good for both of them." "When was the last time you saw either of them smile?" Rick looked from Jake to the empty space where Commander Hayes usually sat, when she occasionally visited the club. "I don't know, Beth. This could really embarrass them both." "Come on, it's harmless," Beth insisted. "What's the worst that could happen?" "They meet, realize they have nothing in common, and go their separate ways. At least they'll have gotten out of their comfort zones for one evening." Beth had always been good at convincing people to go along with her ideas. She had a way of making even questionable plans sound reasonable. Rick found himself nodding despite his doubts. "Okay, but how do we set this up without them figuring out it's a joke?" Beth had already thought about this. "We tell her that he's some important civilian contractor who wants to discuss defense strategies with someone knowledgeable. You know how she loves talking about tactics and military theory. We tell him that she's looking for someone to show her the civilian areas of the station. Maybe help her understand how non-military people live here." "And you think they'll both believe that?" "Why wouldn't they? Neither of them knows much about the other. She probably doesn't even know his name, and he definitely doesn't know anything about her background." Rick had to admit the plan could work. Commander Hayes rarely interacted with civilians except in official meetings. Jake kept to himself so much that most military personnel barely noticed him. They existed in completely different worlds despite living on the same station. "Where would we have them meet?" Rick asked. "Hangar Bay 7, Beth said immediately. "During the evening shift change. It's always busy then. Lots of people around, so if things go badly, they can both escape easily." The more they talked about it, the funnier the idea seemed to Beth. She imagined the awkward conversation, the confused looks, the embarrassment when they realized they had been set up. It would be a story to tell for months. Jake finished his beer and stood up to leave, completely unaware that his evening routine had caught someone's attention. He nodded politely to a few people as he walked past their tables, but no one really looked at him. To them, he was just another civilian worker heading home after a long day. Beth watched him go and felt a small pang of guilt. Jake seemed like a nice enough person, and she didn't want to actually hurt him. But the prank was too perfect to pass up. Tomorrow, she would put her plan into action. Commander Lisa Hayes walked into Hangar Bay 7 exactly on time. Her dress uniform was perfectly pressed, every button polished, every crease sharp. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes scanned the busy area with military precision. She expected to meet a civilian contractor who wanted to discuss defense strategies, someone important enough that her commanding officer had personally requested she take the meeting. Instead, she saw only regular station personnel going about their duties. Mechanics worked on fighter ships, cargo crews loaded supply shuttles, and pilots performed their pre-flight checks. The evening shift change was in full swing, with people coming and going in organized chaos. Lisa checked her watch and frowned. She was never late, and she expected the same from others. Jake Martinez stood near the entrance to the hangar, feeling very out of place among all the military activity. He wore his best civilian clothes, a clean jacket and dark pants, but he still felt underdressed compared to everyone in uniform around him. Beth Collins had told him that Commander Hayes wanted someone to show her the civilian areas of the station, maybe help her understand how non-military families lived there. It seemed like an odd request, but Jake was willing to help. He spotted a woman in a dress uniform looking around the hangar with obvious confusion. She had to be Commander Hayes. Jake had never seen her before, but her posture and the way she carried herself screamed military officer. He took a deep breath and walked over to her. "Excuse me," Jake said politely. "Are you Commander Hayes?" Lisa turned and looked at Jake with sharp eyes. She took in his civilian clothes, his nervous expression, and his slightly awkward stance. This was definitely not the important contractor she had been expecting to meet. "Yes, I am," she said carefully. "And you are?" "Jake Martinez. I believe we have a meeting scheduled?" Lisa's frown deepened. "I was told I would be meeting with a civilian contractor interested in discussing defense strategies. Someone with experience in military logistics." Jake looked confused. "I was told you wanted someone to show you around the civilian sectors of the station, help you understand how families live here." The realization hit both of them at the same time. They had been set up. Lisa's jaw tightened as she understood that someone had wasted her valuable time with a prank. Jake felt his face grow hot with embarrassment as he realized he had been made the target of a joke. "I see," Lisa said, her voice cold with anger. "It appears we have both been deceived." Jake looked down at his feet. "I'm sorry for wasting your time, Commander. I should have known better." Lisa studied him more carefully. Most people would have been angry about being tricked like this. They would have demanded to know who was responsible or made excuses or tried to shift blame. But Jake just apologized and prepared to leave. There was something dignified about his response that surprised her. "It's not your fault," Lisa said, her voice softening slightly. "Neither of us knew what was really happening." Jake nodded and started to turn away. "I'll let you get back to your duties, ma'am. Again, I apologize for the confusion." "Wait," Lisa said, not sure why she was stopping him. "Who told you I wanted to meet?" "Lieutenant Collins," Jake replied. "She said you were interested in learning about civilian life on the station." Lisa made a mental note to have a serious conversation with Lieutenant Collins later. Setting up fake meetings was unprofessional and disrespectful to everyone involved. Before either of them could say anything else, red lights began flashing throughout the hangar. A loud alarm echoed off the metal walls, and the automated announcement system crackled to life. "Alert. Alert. All personnel to emergency stations. Incoming distress signal from Civilian Transport Echo 7. Repeat, Civilian Transport Echo 7 is under attack. All fighter squadrons report for immediate deployment." The hangar exploded into controlled chaos. Pilots ran to their ships, mechanics rushed to perform last-minute checks, and ground crews prepared weapons and fuel systems. Lisa immediately switched into combat mode, her personal frustration forgotten as duty took over. Jake stepped back against the wall, trying to stay out of the way as military personnel rushed past him. His trained eye automatically assessed the situation, even though he was no longer part of it. He could see the tension in people's movements, the urgency in their voices. This was not a drill. Lisa pulled out her communication device and began receiving updates from the command center. Her face grew more serious with each report. Transport Echo 7 is carrying 215 civilians, she said into her comm unit. Families returning from the outer colonies. Raiders are using some kind of jamming technology. Long-range communications are being disrupted. Jake couldn't help but overhear. 200 civilians under attack was serious. Raiders usually targeted military vessels or cargo ships, not passenger transports. Either they were getting bolder, or they were after something specific on that ship. Lisa continued coordinating with the command center while fighter squadrons prepared for launch. Fighter Wing Alpha, you'll take point. Wing Beta will provide cover. Wing Gamma will stay in reserve in case the Raiders have backup. The first squadron of fighters began launching from the hangar, their engines roaring as they accelerated into space. Lisa watched them go, her mind already working through tactical possibilities. The Raiders had chosen their target and timing carefully. Civilian transports were lightly armed and vulnerable, and the jamming technology suggested this was a planned attack, not a random raid. Jake remained quiet against the wall, but his military experience was analyzing everything he saw and heard. The response was fast and professional, but something about the situation bothered him. Raiders smart enough to use advanced jamming wouldn't attack a civilian transport unless they had a specific reason, and if they were smart enough to plan this attack, they would also be smart enough to plan for the rescue attempt. Lisa received another update that made her expression even more grim. Command, Wing Alpha reports heavy interference. They're having trouble maintaining communication with the transport. The jamming is stronger than expected. Jake watched Lisa work and found himself impressed despite the circumstances. She was clearly skilled at her job, coordinating multiple fighter squadrons while staying in contact with the command center, but he could also see the stress building in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened with each piece of bad news. More fighters launched from the hangar as the situation escalated. The noise was overwhelming, but Jake had learned to function in chaos during his military service. He could see that the standard communication protocols weren't going to work against this level of jamming. The rescue mission was flying blind, and that was exactly what the Raiders wanted. Lisa's communication device crackled with static-filled voices from the fighter squadrons. Wing Alpha to base, we've lost contact with the transport. Repeat, no response from Echo 7. We're proceeding on last known coordinates, but we're flying blind out here. Jake could see the weight of responsibility settling on Lisa's shoulders. 200 civilian lives depended on her ability to coordinate this rescue, and the Raiders had taken away her most important tool, communication with her own forces. The situation grew worse by the minute. Lisa Hayes stood in the center of the hangar's command area, surrounded by communication equipment and tactical displays. Red warning lights continued to flash, and the noise of launching fighters mixed with urgent radio chatter. Static filled most of the communications from the rescue squadrons, making coordination nearly impossible. Wing Beta, report your status. Lisa spoke into her headset, but only crackling static came back. She tried again with different frequencies, but the jamming technology the Raiders were using seemed to be blocking everything. Jake Martinez remained against the wall, watching the organized chaos around him. He could see the frustration building in Lisa's posture as she struggled to maintain contact with her pilots. The other officers and technicians in the hangar were all focused on their tasks, but Jake could tell they were worried. Without communication, the rescue mission was operating blind. A young technician approached Lisa with a tablet showing sensor readings. Commander, we're detecting the jamming signal source. It's not coming from the Raider ships attacking the transport. There's something else out there, something big. Lisa studied the readings with growing concern. How big? Initial scans suggest destroyer class may be larger. The jamming equipment would need significant power to affect this wide an area. Jake's military instincts told him this was very bad news. Raiders usually operated in small, fast ships that could hit targets and escape quickly. If they had destroyer-class vessels, this wasn't a simple raid for cargo or supplies. This was something much more serious. Lisa tried once more to contact Wing Alpha. Alpha Leader, do you copy? Please respond. Nothing but static answered her. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 200 civilian lives pressing down on her shoulders. Jake had seen this type of jamming before, during his service in the outer colony conflicts. The enemy had used similar tactics to disrupt Marine communications during ground operations. But the Marines had developed ways to work around it, techniques that might still be effective against this kind of interference. He knew he should stay quiet. He was a civilian now, no longer part of military operations, but watching Lisa struggle with a problem he might be able to solve was painful. Lives were at stake, and his pride wasn't worth more than the safety of 200 innocent people. Jake approached Lisa carefully, not wanting to interrupt her work, but knowing he had to speak up. "Commander Hayes?" Lisa turned to him, surprise and frustration clear on her face. She had forgotten he was still there. "Mr. Martinez, you should really leave the hangar. This is a military operation." "I understand that, ma'am," Jake said quietly, "but I might be able to help with the communication problem." Lisa's first reaction was to dismiss him. He was a civilian maintenance worker, not a military communication specialist, but something in his voice made her pause. There was no boasting, no demand for attention, just a quiet confidence that suggested he knew what he was talking about. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I've seen this type of jamming before," Jake explained. "During the outer colony conflicts, the enemy used similar technology to disrupt our communications. We developed some techniques to work around it." Lisa looked at him more carefully. "The outer colony conflicts ended 5 years ago. Were you military?" "Marine Corps," Jake said simply. "I served 3 tours before I was discharged." Lisa's opinion of Jake began to shift. The outer colony conflicts had been brutal, fought against well-equipped enemies in difficult conditions. Anyone who had served 3 tours and survived had definitely seen combat. "What kind of techniques?" she asked. Jake moved closer to the communication equipment. "The jamming works by flooding specific frequencies with interference. But if you use a rotating frequency pattern with short burst transmissions, you can sometimes get through. The key is to change frequencies faster than their equipment can adapt." A senior technician overheard and shook his head. "We've tried frequency rotation. It doesn't work against this level of jamming." "Not standard rotation," Jake said patiently. "You need to use a pattern that looks random but isn't. The receiving end needs to know the pattern so they can follow along. We called it ghost protocol because the transmissions would appear and disappear like ghosts." Lisa looked at her technicians, who were clearly skeptical. But they had been trying everything else without success, and the civilian transport was still in danger. "Show us," Lisa said. Jake worked with the technicians to modify the communication settings. His hands moved confidently over the equipment despite his prosthetic left arm. He programmed in a complex frequency pattern that seemed random, but followed mathematical rules that both the sender and receiver could calculate. "Wing Alpha. This is base control," Lisa spoke into the modified communication system. "Do you copy? Switch to Ghost Protocol Pattern 7. For a moment there was only static. Then a voice came through clearly, though briefly. "Base Control, this is Alpha Leader. We copy you clearly. Switching to Ghost Protocol." The hangar erupted in relieved cheers. Communication had been restored. Lisa looked at Jake with new respect and curiosity. This wasn't amateur luck. He had solved a problem that had stumped her trained technicians. "Alpha Leader. Report your status," Lisa said into the headset. "Base Control. We've reached the transport's last known position. The ship is heavily damaged but still intact. We count approximately 15 raider vessels of various sizes, but there's something else out here." Lisa's blood went cold. "Define something else, Alpha Leader." 2 large ships, destroyer-class minimum. They're hanging back from the main attack, but they're definitely part of the raider force. This isn't a random attack, Base Control. This is organized. Jake listened to the report with growing concern. Organized raider attacks with destroyer-class support meant this was either a very wealthy raider group, or they were working with someone who had access to military-grade equipment. Either way, the rescue mission had just become much more dangerous. Lisa was thinking the same thing. "Alpha Leader, can you get a visual on the civilian transport? What's their condition?" Transport appears to be venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. They're still alive in there, but not for long. The raiders seem to be trying to disable them rather than destroy them. They want something from that ship. Can you engage the raider vessels? Negative, Base Control. We're outnumbered 3-1, and those destroyers haven't even entered the fight yet. If we engage now, we'll lose the squadrons and the transport. Lisa closed her eyes, weighing impossible choices. If she ordered the attack, her pilots would likely be destroyed. If she didn't, the civilian transport would either be captured or destroyed anyway. 200 innocent lives hung in the balance. Jake stepped closer to Lisa. "Commander, there might be another option." She looked at him, desperate enough to listen to any suggestion. "What?" "Those destroyers are staying back for a reason. They're either waiting for something or they're trying to avoid detection by long-range sensors. If we can figure out why they're holding back, we might be able to use it against them." Lisa turned to her sensor technician. "Can you get detailed scans of those destroyer-class vessels?" "Working on it, Commander. The jamming is interfering with our sensors too, but the Ghost Protocol modification seems to be helping with that as well." Jake's simple communication fix had solved more than just the radio problem. It was also helping their sensors cut through the interference. For the first time since the crisis began, Lisa felt like they might have a chance. Heavy footsteps echoed across the hangar floor as Admiral Sam Harrison strode through the entrance. At 62 years old, the Admiral still carried himself like the war hero he was. His gray hair was cut military short, and his blue eyes missed nothing as they swept across the scene of controlled chaos. Every person in the hangar knew who he was, Admiral. Harrison had commanded fleets in the first human-alien contact wars and written most of the tactical manuals they all studied. "Commander Hayes," the Admiral called out as he approached the command area. "Report!" Lisa snapped to attention immediately. "Admiral, we have a civilian transport under attack by raiders. Approximately 200 civilians on board. The enemy is using advanced jamming technology and has destroyer-class support vessels." Admiral Harrison nodded grimly. He had been monitoring the situation from the command center, but the presence of destroyer-class vessels had convinced him to take direct control of the operation. This was no ordinary raider attack. "What's our current status with the rescue squadrons?" he asked. "We've restored communications using a modified frequency protocol," Lisa reported. "Our pilots have visual contact with the transport, but they're heavily outnumbered. The civilian ship is taking damage but still intact. Modified frequency protocol?" The Admiral's eyebrows rose slightly. "Who developed the modification?" Lisa glanced toward Jake, who had stepped back to give them space for their military discussion. "A civilian contractor provided assistance with the communication problem, sir." Admiral Harrison followed her gaze to Jake Martinez, who stood quietly near the wall in his civilian clothes. The Admiral's sharp eyes took in everything. The way Jake stood with unconscious military bearing despite his casual clothes. The careful way he kept his left arm close to his side. The alert but respectful expression of someone who understood military operations. "What's his name?" Admiral Harrison asked. "Jake Martinez, sir," Lisa replied. The Admiral went very still. His eyes fixed on Jake with sudden intensity, and the command area around them gradually fell quiet as people noticed the Admiral's focused attention. "Jake Martinez," the Admiral repeated slowly, his voice carrying across the hangar. "Formerly Sergeant Jake Martinez of the 3rd Marine Reconnaissance Battalion." Jake straightened slightly, his civilian posture shifting into something more military despite his clothes. "Yes, sir." The noise in the hangar began to fade as more people turned to watch the conversation. Pilots preparing for deployment, mechanics working on fighters, technicians monitoring communications. Everyone sensed that something important was happening. Admiral Harrison stepped closer to Jake, his voice growing louder and more formal. "The Jake Martinez who held the defensive line at Centauri Prime for 18 hours against overwhelming odds?" "Sir, I was part of a team," Jake said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the increasingly silent hangar. "The Jake Martinez who saved the Kepler colony evacuation by coordinating precision strikes while under direct enemy fire." The Admiral's voice now reached every corner of the hangar. Jake's face tightened slightly. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Admiral Harrison turned to address the entire hangar, his voice taking on the tone he used for formal ceremonies. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of one of the most decorated heroes in recent military history." The hangar fell completely silent. Even the emergency alarm seemed quieter as hundreds of people stopped what they were doing to listen. Sergeant Martinez led a reconnaissance team that held a crucial defensive position on Centauri Prime for 18 hours, the Admiral continued. His team of 12 Marines held off 3 separate enemy assault waves while protecting the evacuation of over 4,000 civilian colonists. Lisa stared at Jake with new understanding. Centauri Prime was legendary in military circles, a desperate last stand that had saved thousands of lives. She had studied the battle in the academy. When conventional communications failed during the siege, Admiral Harrison went on, Sergeant Martinez developed field modifications to radio equipment that allowed coordination with evacuation ships. The technique he improvised that day is now standard protocol, taught to all communication specialists. The young pilots and technicians in the hangar looked at Jake with growing amazement. The quiet civilian they had barely noticed was the person who had invented techniques they used every day. At Kepler Colony, the Admiral's voice grew even more serious. Sergeant Martinez's unit was tasked with protecting the main evacuation site. When enemy forces broke through the perimeter, he remained behind to coordinate defensive fire while his team evacuated with the civilians. Jake's jaw tightened, and his right hand unconsciously moved toward his left arm. Sergeant Martinez called in precision orbital strikes on his own position to stop the enemy advance. Admiral Harrison continued. He maintained communication with the strike coordination team until the last possible moment, ensuring maximum effectiveness of the bombardment while giving evacuation ships time to escape. The silence in the hangar was now complete. Even the background hum of machinery seemed muted as everyone absorbed what they were hearing. The enemy assault was stopped, and over 6,000 civilians were successfully evacuated from Kepler Colony, the Admiral said. Sergeant Martinez was found in the ruins of the command post 3 hours later. He had lost his left arm and most of his unit, but he had saved thousands of lives. Lisa understood now why Jake was so quiet, why he kept to himself, why he seemed uncomfortable with the tension. He carried the weight of survival when others had not. The tactical innovations Sergeant Martinez developed during those battles, Admiral Harrison announced to the silent crowd, are now standard doctrine in the Naval Academy curriculum. Every officer in this hangar has studied his methods, whether they knew it or not. Rick Palmer and Beth Collins stood frozen near their fighter, realizing that their harmless prank had involved one of the most respected war heroes in the fleet. Beth felt sick as she understood how badly she had misjudged the situation. Furthermore, the Admiral continued, the communication protocol modification that just restored contact with our rescue squadrons is based on techniques Sergeant Martinez pioneered during the Centauri Prime siege. Admiral Harrison turned back to Jake, his voice returning to a more personal tone but still carrying across the hangar. Sergeant Martinez retired from active duty 3 years ago due to his injuries. He has been working as a civilian contractor on this station, contributing to our defense efforts in his own quiet way. Jake stood straighter, accepting the attention he clearly didn't want, but understanding that the Admiral was making a point to everyone present. The communication breakthrough that may save 200 civilian lives today, Admiral Harrison concluded, came from the same mind that saved 10,000 lives at Centauri Prime and Kepler Colony. The Admiral then did something that shocked everyone in the hangar. He came to attention and saluted Jake Martinez. In the military, saluting a civilian was highly unusual, reserved only for the most exceptional circumstances. Every person in uniform in the hangar followed the Admiral's lead, coming to attention and saluting the quiet man in civilian clothes who had been invisible to them just minutes before. The salute held for a long moment before Admiral Harrison lowered his hand. The silence in the hangar remained complete as hundreds of people tried to process what they had just learned. Jake Martinez stood quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but accepting it with the same dignity he had shown throughout the evening. Now then, Admiral Harrison said, turning back to the tactical situation, let's save those civilians. The spell broke, and activity resumed throughout the hangar. But everything had changed. People looked at Jake with respect and curiosity instead of indifference. The quiet civilian they had ignored was now revealed as a living legend. Admiral, Lisa said, our squadrons are still outnumbered and waiting for orders. What's your assessment of the situation, Commander Hayes? Lisa consulted her tactical displays. The raiders have 15 smaller vessels actively attacking the transport, plus 2 destroyer-class ships holding back. Our 3 squadrons can handle the smaller ships, but those destroyers change everything. Admiral Harrison nodded. Mr. Martinez, you've seen this type of tactical setup before. What are those destroyers waiting for? Jake moved closer to the tactical display, his years of experience taking over. In the colony wars, enemy forces used destroyer-class ships as command vessels. They would stay back to coordinate attacks and avoid risk. But there's another possibility, which is, they might be waiting for reinforcements, Jake said quietly. Or they could be there to capture the transport intact, not destroy it. If they wanted everyone dead, they would have destroyed the ship already. Admiral Harrison studied the sensor readings. What would they want from a civilian transport? Information, Jake replied. Passenger lists, cargo manifests, navigation data. If they're working with someone on the inside, they might be after specific people or specific cargo. Lisa felt a chill as she realized the implications. Admiral, if this is an organized intelligence operation instead of a random raid, then we're dealing with something much more serious than pirates, Admiral Harrison finished. Mr. Martinez, what would you recommend? Jake studied the tactical display for a moment. Send 2 squadrons to engage the smaller vessels directly. Make it look like a standard rescue attempt. But hold the 3rd squadron back, hidden behind the station's sensor shadow. And then, when the destroyers move in to support their smaller ships, the hidden squadron hits them from behind. Destroyers are powerful, but they're not designed for close-range fighter combat. Admiral Harrison smiled grimly. Commander Hayes, implement Mr. Martinez's tactical plan. Lisa began issuing orders to the squadrons. Wing Alpha and Beta, begin your attack runs on the smaller raider vessels. Wing Gamma, hold position behind the station and await further orders. The communication system, still using Jake's frequency modifications, carried the orders clearly to all units. Within minutes, the rescue operation was underway, with Jake's tactical plan guiding the attack. Wing Alpha engaging, came the report from the lead squadron. Raiders are responding as expected. The destroyer-class ships are moving to support. Wing Gamma, you are cleared for your attack run, Lisa ordered. Hit those destroyers from behind. The tactical display showed the battle unfolding exactly as Jake had predicted. The hidden squadron caught the destroyer-class ships completely by surprise, crippling them before they could bring their heavy weapons to bear on the rescue squadrons. Transport Echo 7 is secure, came the triumphant report. All raiders destroyed or fleeing. Civilian casualties are minimal. Beginning evacuation of damaged transport. The hangar erupted in cheers. 200 civilian lives had been saved, and the raider force had been completely defeated. Admiral Harrison turned to Jake with obvious satisfaction. Outstanding tactical analysis, Mr. Martinez, the Admiral said formally, which brings me to something I've been considering. Jake looked curious but wary. I'm offering you a position as Senior Tactical Consultant for the fleet, Admiral Harrison announced. Full military honors, rank equivalent to your previous service, and assignment to work directly with Commander Hayes' tactical operations team. The offer stunned everyone within hearing. Senior tactical consultant positions were reserved for the most experienced military minds, and they came with tremendous responsibility and respect. Jake looked around the hangar at all the faces watching him. For 3 years he had worked quietly in maintenance, trying to stay invisible, avoiding the attention that his military service had brought him. But tonight had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. He was good at saving lives. I accept, Admiral, Jake said quietly. The hangar erupted in cheers again, louder than before. Admiral Harrison smiled and shook Jake's hand. Welcome back to the service, Mr. Martinez. Your first assignment is to work with Commander Hayes to analyze tonight's attack and determine if we're facing a larger threat. Lisa stepped forward, her professional demeanor softened by genuine respect. Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology for our earlier meeting. I would be honored to work with you. Jake smiled for the first time that evening. Please call me Jake. And I think we were both victims of someone else's idea of humor. Admiral Harrison looked around the hangar until his eyes found Lieutenant Beth Collins and Rick Palmer, who were trying to make themselves invisible near their fighter. Lieutenant Collins, Lieutenant Palmer, report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We need to discuss appropriate professional behavior. Beth's face went white as she realized the Admiral knew exactly who was responsible for the evening's prank. What had seemed like harmless fun had now involved a war hero and taken place during a military crisis. Yes, sir, both lieutenants replied weakly. As the immediate crisis ended and normal operations resumed, Jake found himself surrounded by people who wanted to meet him properly. Pilots who had studied his tactics, technicians who used his innovations, officers who had heard stories about his service, all of them wanting to shake his hand and express their respect. Lisa watched from nearby, amazed at the transformation. A few hours ago, Jake had been a lonely civilian sitting by himself in the officers' club. Now he was the center of attention, surrounded by people eager to learn from him, but she could see that he was still uncomfortable with the recognition. "Jake," she said, approaching him during a brief break in the crowd, "would you like to continue that conversation we were supposed to have? Not about civilian life on the station, but about working together?" Jake smiled again, more relaxed now. "I'd like that, Commander Hayes." "Lisa," she said. "If we're going to be working together, you should call me Lisa." As they talked, the last of the rescue shuttles docked with the station, carrying the evacuated civilians from the damaged transport. 200 people who had been in mortal danger were now safe, thanks in large part to the tactical expertise of a quiet man who had been set up as the target of a joke. Admiral Harrison watched Jake and Lisa begin planning their analysis of the night's events. He had recognized Jake's name immediately and had been looking for an opportunity to bring him back into active service. The young lieutenant's misguided prank had accidentally created the perfect situation. As the hangar finally returned to normal operations, Beth Collins and Rick Palmer cleaned their equipment in silence. Their harmless joke had revealed a war hero, saved 200 lives, and brought together two of the fleet's most talented tactical minds. They had no idea that their prank would be remembered not as a joke, but as the night when Jake Martinez came home.